In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
And have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, humans of the internet. Welcome back to the episode of It's Not Just in Your Head, a podcast by two zany therapists talking about how capitalism is great for mental health and it's the only possible option we have. And everyone should own the means of production. I'm Max Golding, LMFT. We have Harriet Fraud, PhD here. And today we're going to talk about evictions. So if you don't want to listen to the rest of the podcast, evictions suck. And there you go. Evictions are terrible. They are terrible to experience. Oh, and before we forget actually to do the patron thing, a special thank you to patrons First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, Bandila MC Manga, Evan Lee, and Ashley. And as always, Liam, thank you for doing all the editing and stuff.
Yes, many thank yous to all for making this possible.
Yeah. Okay, so the way we're going to talk about evictions today, there were two separate people we were trying to get on as guests, but it was kind of too short notice. So we're doing it without guests who are sort of either policy experts or organizers around this. Harriet's going to say some things in a bit, but I'm going to kind of go through actually starting from a little bit of a personal story because I'm not just a mental health person, I'm a person and I've experienced eviction. So I'm going to just start with that story. So, or maybe the background. Why are we talking about eviction? So it's probably obvious to most people that there is this thing called an eviction crisis that's going on. And when COVID started, this was also when that kind of hashtag rent strike was floating around everywhere because nobody really knew what was going to happen with their housing situations. And people were saying, well, let's just go on rent strike. And there actually were some rent strikes, but what ended up happening was there was this big federal eviction moratorium that came actually out of the CDC, which is kind of historic, the Center for Disease Control. And a couple months ago, the Supreme Court shot down this CDC eviction moratorium, saying that the CDC didn't have the power to do that. I think that I don't remember if that was July or August, but
this summer anyway.
It was a summer, and and by the way, if you look into this a little bit, the moratorium didn't actually stop all evictions. There were eviction filings still happening. Analysts it depends on who you read, but it looks like it probably cut filings at least in half of what their normal rates were, which is good, but they were still actually going through the courts. So, I mean, the courts, some judges apparently were just like, we don't care what the CDC has to say anyway. And they just did it anyway. But I wanted to share my story to actually clarify, since I know a fair amount about this intimately, so people understand the eviction process and like the experience of it, how it makes you feel, some of the mental health ramifications of it. So, first to clarify, so every state and county is a little bit different. Where I live, and this is, I think, generally true, you're supposed to receive something, a court order, called an unlawful detainer, which is the landlord has actually filed in court saying, there's some legitimate reason, like the tenant has not paid rent or something. And so they're like unlawfully, still on the premises, despite like they're not allowed to. And then the court says, okay, this looks legit. And then they send out the court order. And within a certain number of days, the tenant has to either respond to the court and say, speak to my attorney. And like how many tenants paying rent tend to have attorneys like next to 0%. Or they have to, or they show up in court and they come up with something they scramble to try to find like a legal aid, like a free or cheap lawyer. But usually it's more like either they just flee the situation somehow, which means either like leaving all their crap in the house, and that's extremely traumatizing, or finding storage if they can afford it, or asking a family member, or packing everything into their car. Other times it means they just say like, I can't do anything. And sheriffs come. Basically the cops come to your door and throw you out and throw out your possessions.
Also there's some people who get the court notice, don't know what to do, ignore it, or it gets lost in the mail, and then along comes the sheriff.
Right. Exactly. So that happens as well. And there issues around that can be like language barrier. Like that's a huge one. There can be, education sort of, it's not like, oh, these uneducated tenants or something, but I mean, sometimes, and I'll get into my story in a second, but most of the time, most ordinary people, when you receive some sort of court document, they're not only are they extremely scary, but they are often actually pretty confusing because legal language in these official formal notices, they're actually not always as clear and understandable as you'd think. And even figuring out what the process is of like who you call or email or where you go isn't always as clear as people think. And sometimes I think the courts know this. And it was just, this was by design and the way things were constructed because the propertied class kind of like designed our entire judicial system. So they're like, oh, well, I have all this fancy education. I know what this term means and what that means or whatever. But other times it's ignorance on their part. They don't understand like how difficult to understand some of these things are. But anyway, you get a notice on your door, you freak out. So here's my story, because this is more what is sometimes called a soft eviction. And this to me is actually equally to more terrifying of a problem that occurs all the time and is not talked about enough. So it was like 5 or 6 years ago. I was living with a few other people in an apartment building. And one day we got a 3-day pay or quit notice on the door. So 3-day pay or quit means within 3 days you pay your rent or you will be evicted. We will throw you out. So we all scrambled. It was a week or two after the first of the month. And we were like, well, I paid my rent. I put my check into your thing, or I Venmo'd you, or whatever the hell our process was. And we were like scrambling and arguing. And so was like, no, I did drop off the check like at the actual place, like always. I don't know what this is about. And we tried calling and emailing, nothing. The next day, nothing. So they were actually ignoring us. It took a couple of days. I don't remember I don't have like a factual timeline here, but it took a couple of days. Finally, they got back to us and they're like, yeah, you didn't pay your rent. And then we went back and forth with them. There's some like raising of voices on both sides. And they were like, oh, yeah, we found the rent check. Our mistake. We made a mistake. Oh. That's basically what happened. But we were all still really like, I don't want to overuse that term traumatized, but it was an extremely distressing experience that then created from that point forward, before I even get into the other pieces, a sort of hypervigilance, a collective hypervigilance of all of us as tenants in that building, or in that rental unit, not the building yet. I'll get to that. So anyway, we thought, okay, this is just a mistake they made. These people are total assholes, whatever. But there was already the seed planted in our minds. Should we move? Should we leave? Because this was extremely scary, and they just threatened to take away our housing based off of a mistake. And we were like, can they even do that? Right? Like, can you put an eviction notice on somebody's door based on a mistake? Are you even allowed to do that? And if you are not allowed to do that, what recourse do we even have? Right? So anyway, that was the beginning of it. A couple weeks later, we get a notice on the door again. And just so people understand, when you see that notice, before you even see what it says, now that you have that hypervigilance, your heart kind of stops and you're like, shit, are we going to have to move? Like, what happened this time? What's going on? And it's a legitimate fight or flight response you have. So this one, it was just it was a late fee for rent, which again, we all talked to each other. Hey, we paid the rent on time, right? They verified that over the phone, this and this and that. And we're like, okay, we need to start doing emails to get written records, but they weren't responding to the emails. So again, we had to call. I think one of us, I didn't, but somebody else went to actually talk to the manager, which was like, but not too far away, but it was like, they're not on site. You had to go to another part of town to go like bang on their door and say, hey, we need to talk. And they were like, okay, this is another mistake. You didn't pay your rent late. So, at this point, we're kind of, like I said, the seed was planted. Should we just leave? Because this at this point is starting to feel like intimidation or harassment or something. Like they're messing with us, right? Like, are these really mistakes? So we start coming up with this conspiracy theory, like they're trying to do something here. But that was, again, the seed was still very small. A couple weeks later, we started noticing notices on everybody else's door. And we weren't reading them all. We just started noticing. But it was from one neighbor I talked to, it was a similar thing. There was I actually don't remember if it was a pay or quit or something else. And then somebody else got a rent hike notice. So we realized, okay, so the owners of this building or the management or whatever, they are systematically like like
Harassing.
harassing, intimidating everybody in the building right now, right? And so this, again, we were like, okay, we should get the fuck out of here. Like, this is really scary. But you can't just get out of there. That's the thing people don't understand. Like, you can't just move. Like, moving is not, especially, so living in Santa Barbara, California, sometimes we think like, oh, this is a Santa Barbara specific thing. There's not enough housing supply. The housing is expensive or whatever. This is everywhere now. People talk about this as if it's a local problem. The so-called housing supply, the housing stock is, hasn't been growing at the pace of sort of housing demand, of people kind of, I don't know if it's city population growth or what it is exactly, but.
Well, it's certainly, you know what it is in New York? Because I live in New York. It's that they're building luxury condos and they're tearing down affordable housing all over the city. So it's an acute crisis here too, on the other end of the United States.
And that's a different, And there's, by the way, anybody listening, there's a good book, In Defense of Housing, by Marcuse. I forgot the first name. That one's really good. And also Capital City by another name I'm forgetting. But these two books, they focus on New York as like sort of the one of the best examples of how the real estate industry operates and how it kind of screws with people's lives. But so Santa Barbara doesn't have that exact problem of like affordable housing being replaced for luxury condos, although the city council over the last few years has been approving more and more kind of luxury housing. And then the housing advocates come out and say like, what the hell are you doing? And they're like, well, the developers just refuse to build it because they can't make enough, profit off of it. And we're like, well, can't you force them? And they're like, no, we're a small municipal government. We have no power over capital. Sorry. And like, no one's like identifying the elephant in the room. Like, well, capital's king here. So your small little city government is like, it's like powerless kind of. So anyway, there's some context. So anyway, so this keeps going on. There's another notice. There's another notice. We're noticing the neighbors. If I knew what I knew now, if I had this sort of like organizing, red commie scumbag fire in me in the same way, like 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said, we need to organize this apartment building, et cetera, et cetera. We need to fight back like collectively against these bastards. But we didn't. What we ended up doing was what most normal people do. A couple more months went by, and then they sent this. The final notice we got was a rent hike notice saying, your lease expires in January, and we're hiking the rents. And we sat down, we talked together, and I was like, I could afford another X amount of dollars. I really don't want to, but I will. And one of the other tenants was just like, no, I can't. I can barely afford this. Like, I'm scraping by paying this. Other tenants like same. The other tenant said, I just don't want to deal with these people anymore. I want to get the hell out of here. And so we all just agreed, like, let's get the fuck out of here, So, so this, what I just described is what is often called a soft eviction. And so this whole building, actually, I should add, this building was then in a series of buildings. So in Santa Barbara, it's called Ivy Apartments, like IVY. It was a series of, I guess that's the name of the apartments. It's not the management company. It was a different management company. But then there's a different owner, which full circle, it's an owner that me and some tenant organizers are picking a big fight with right now, actually, for some other tenants we're helping. So this housing advocacy org in town called Cause actually launched this really big and very slow but relatively successful campaign to change some of the city laws because of what happened in this building. I didn't know till later, but our building was sort of used as an example because they were paying attention to what was going on. They were talking to some of the immigrant Latino tenants. That's like their main kind of base. So it ended up them fighting for a package of housing policies, which included rent control, which has not yet gone. They haven't really decided that yet. Just cause eviction and a couple other things. Anyway, the point being, tons of people in this building left without getting formal eviction notices, myself included. So we were all victims of a mass eviction and a soft eviction. Mass eviction is like, lots at once. Soft eviction is nothing was actually filed in the court. Now, the reason this is really significant and it's a really insidious problem is because there's actually no record of this being an eviction. Like the landlord people, the real estate industry, all these people would say, well, that's not an eviction. So, so the data we have on evictions is actually really bad because when people scrape data from county courts, if they're lucky enough to even obtain it, because it's really hard to get for sometimes good reasons, other times bad reasons. Soft evictions are not filed anywhere. There's no data on soft evictions. So what I just described, it never happened as far as like the documentation goes, right? And wherever you live, whoever you are, there are tons of soft evictions happening all around you all the time. Before the pandemic, during the pandemic, after the pandemic, a landlord will come in. And so another example from some tenants we're organizing, this is after they kind of exercise their rights. And the number one tenant, who's sort of the leader in this building that has done all the work, and the landlords know it, they send a leaf blower person to blow the leaves at the apartment building twice a day, 2 separate leaf blower guys at 2 separate times of the day, right outside of the guy's window. So this is clearly retaliation. But again, like, how would you prove that? I mean, he can film it, but then someone could say, well, there's not 2-way consent for you to film it, so you have to toss that evidence out. You could get the audio. You could say, oh, it was at 9 a.m. and then it was at 3 p.m. or something, and my wife has to do Zoom stuff for her job. And you could say this happened in a timeline within 90 days of us raising our rights to the landlord. Well, what do? You compile that information. Then what? Then you go hire a lawyer. Then you go to the court to sue the landlord for damages. Maybe. I mean, will you find a lawyer
if you have the money? Yeah.
If you have the money to pay a lawyer, that's going to be hundreds of dollars per hour. That's going to charge you for a shit ton of research. The time it takes to file. If there's litigation, they're going for that, and then like a counter conversation, or maybe the mediation happens or something. So that's like thousands of dollars, and that's like money you probably don't have, right, as a tenant.
Right.
So even in this case, right, they're trying to soft evict this tenant, also knowing in the union busting way that this is the leader of the union, so to speak, that if they cut off the head of the union, then everybody else that's been sort of unified might just leave, because they'll say, well, we're disorganized. We don't know what to do. So these are really common landlord tactics. I hate to sound so like dark about it. Like, this is all the landlords. There's good mom and pop landlords and everything, but so this is soft eviction. Soft evictions are really traumatizing. And the other reason it's really traumatizing is the disempowerment aspect, that when this happens to you, realize I have no recourse. The law is on their side. The lawyers are on their side. They have lots of money. They own the deed. They own the building. And in many cases, because of the rise of something called LLC landlordism, and LLC is a limited liability company, there's a chance that the name registered for that LLC, for that corporation, is just some random person, and it's not the owner. And that there's either one owner or 2 partners, 3 partners, 10 shareholders, that this building that you live in is just this investment vehicle that some, finance and real estate sector people are just throwing money into as a series of, as investment vehicles on a spreadsheet for them, essentially. And so sometimes even figuring out if we are going to try to fight and punch up against these people oppressing us, where do we go? So, and I have other crazy stories, but I'll just pause for a second to say, so this was all before the pandemic. This is not pandemic related eviction. But so what I just explained, imagine during the pandemic, try to multiply this in your mind, like by hundreds, thousands, millions of people, they did not receive unlawful detainer notices. The landlord just said, look, you just missed your rent. You're going to have to leave. And they said, some tenants probably said, you can't do that because the eviction moratorium. And the landlord says, I don't care. You owe me money. I'm the landlord. And they say, okay, fine, we'll leave. That's actually what happens most of the time. Most tenants don't go like, my lawyer will speak to you, or I know my rights, or whatever. Or sometimes they'll say, I know my rights, but they're huffing and puffing. They're getting so mad. And then there's all kinds of illegal things landlords will do. They'll shut off your electricity for not paying the rent. They'll lock you out. And these are like very patently illegal. And I'm pretty sure every state in the country, but they do it anyway. And again, tenants often just don't know what the hell to do. Because they
don't have the legal recourse. There are tenants. I had a client who was in Harlem, Harlem is a neighborhood in New York that was being gentrified, and they were constantly harassed. They were tearing down walls by mistake because they were doing work on an adjoining apartment. They were woken up, their utilities were turned off, and they didn't know what to do except call the city complaints department, and nothing happened.
Right, exactly. Because there's a backlog. This is to bring it home, these terms we use, neoliberalism and austerity and stuff, that in part because of the way that sort of capital, finance capital, real estate capital just exploded in power it from, say, 70s, 80s to now, and then government services were, cut to pieces all over the country. It's not that like government's useless, that you report to an agency or the city attorney or a code violation. There's all kinds of entity, Fair Housing Board. There's all these places, but very often they're backlogged. They're so understaffed, sometimes underpaid. I mean, some of these guys actually get paid, decent salaries and stuff, but they're just really overworked. And the level of the crisis, this is the irony too. The level of the crisis is that you would say, okay, this is an emergency. I'm locked out of my house. I need to call the cops. Well, technically, the cops are they're almost always on the side of the landlord.
The landlord, that's right.
They exist. I mean, because America was built on private property relations. It's not like the cops as individuals, even like, I don't think they tend to understand this. It's just their role is to mostly uphold the law, but it's
defend property.
Right. Foundationally, that is what their job is to do. This is why the cops are utilized to remove you from where you're renting if you don't pay the rent. The landlord says, hey, cops, go get them, right? Or hey, court, is it okay? And the court says, of course, property owner. All right, send the cops if they don't respond in 5 days, right?
And also part of the trouble is that starting with Reagan, when the United States became a much more unequal and unjust country, they started, Reagan very successfully vilified, made the enemy of the government, even though our government is the best democracy money can buy. And we have people who need vast campaign chests provided by the people with the money. And so the corporations are laughing while people blame the government and cut government jobs, which happens because they won't tax the rich. In New York City, where I live, there's a building on 59th Street, very central building on Columbus Circle, where over 75% of the apartments are owned by legal liability companies, LLCs, so the owners aren't even visible and are very difficult to trace because they're usually rich people using real estate as a safe deposit box.
Right.
And these are rich people from all over the world. They know the United States doesn't have revolutions, so they sock away their ill-gotten gains in real estate.
It's money laundering. Real estate has become a money laundering and tax evasion. I mean, there's a Facebook group that I may or may not have access to that's new real estate agents that are often actually talking about cash flipping properties in Southern California. This is just where I live, so I pay attention. I like to spy on the bad guys online a little bit. These people are like, oh, I got this cash, this amount in cash right now, right? Now, why that's so bizarre, right? Like, why would there be this like cash now, buy this home, flip this property? It's undervalued. Right. It's undervalued. What does that mean? Undervalued. It's under market value. What is market value? Oh, well, it's this many blocks from the beach, and it's that many blocks from the new hipster coffee shop in the art district of the, that used to be blue collar, Black, Latino, poor working class people over there. And now it's like all these breweries and all this gentrified crap. And it's like, oh, look, it's 3 blocks from there. So when they talk about market rate, just to tangent a bit on that, market rate, this is my definition of market rate. This is not a heterodox economic, and it's also not a Marxian economics thing. In my view, market rate just refers to what the capitalist class in any area has successfully collectively bargained to make the price of something in that area. So, and I'm talking about rent specifically. That could apply to anything else. But it'd say, well, the market rate is $1,000 for this unit or $3,000 for this unit. It's not. It's a sleight of hand. It's just the classic free market, invisible hand crap, where they're not taking into account that if you fought rent control, if you paid off politicians, if you have your apartment and real estate association people with mobs of corporate lawyers, also linked to like cartels and international money laundering schemes, have fought tooth and nail to regulate pricing and just regulations around housing in general, and then you kick out a bunch of tenants over here, you raise the price by $1,000 here, $1,000 there. You are successfully raising the price everywhere in that city. that normalizes a higher market value. It's not because of the pretty mountains and hiking over there or the beach over there. I mean, there's some, I would say, so you look at one region versus another and you say, yeah, maybe rent should be higher there because it's nicer or something, right? But they always try to get you with that. Like Santa Barbara is a great example. They're like, we got the beach, you guys got the mountains, you got this thing and that thing. And you say, oh, well, I guess we should pay $3,000 more for a 2-bedroom or whatever, Well,
that's what we talked about before. There is no city, state, or county in the United States where two people could rent a 2-bedroom apartment
on a minimum wage
for their salary if they had 2 people making full-time minimum wages. And, as an illustration, in New York City, where I live, one of the most elegant streets is 57th Street. And between all the way from 8th Avenue all the way to 3rd Avenue, 75% of the buildings are not occupied because they're bought as investments. And that's what drives up the cost of apartments and the rents.
Right.
Because this becomes part of a capital exchange. And one of the things that eviction tells you is, as people in our society, our government has failed. It has failed, and it failed because it's bought and sold. But nonetheless, it's failed to provide a basic need for human survival. Because if you're on the street, you lose out on all basic needs. You lose out on healthy food, breathable air, clean water, which you don't have easy access to, obviously shelter from the elements, temperature regulation, heat in the winter, air conditioning when it's unbearable in the summer, rest and restorative sleep, because if you try to rest on the sidewalk, who knows what could happen to you. Clean, breathable air, medical care, and protection against physical and emotional violence. You are subject to violence. I remember seeing this older woman who was homeless begging. The next day I saw her all beat up, because those are the people you can take it out on. And I think that our capitalist society has failed. Basic needs should not be left to be commodified by traders trying to make money. They should be guaranteed, and the people who have the money should be taxed, so that Bezos is not going in outer space for 500 million while millions are being thrown on the street.
So an article, there's a lot of articles I was looking at before, both of us were looking up before this, by the way, and we kind of wanted to lead with my personal story, then kind of expand into the political. But there's one in particular also, because we're probably admittedly a little shitty on race. We don't, because we're just like white people that don't know what we're talking about. But we know, but we don't experience it directly. We experience, as a woman, I certainly experience other kinds of discrimination, but not racial. Sure. Well, but there's this article that, I mean, even beyond just racial analysis of the eviction crisis, there's this, and I'll link it in the show notes, but there's one by the Brookings Institute that's just, the report is titled, "The Coming Eviction Crisis Will Hit Black Communities the Hardest." And it's actually not totally about sort of the racialized dynamic. It's also just about the eviction crisis. Then it gets into the racial component. And I'm going to just read a couple of things. I thought it was like incredibly fascinating. So it kind of just lays out the, estimated 30 million to 40 million people in the U.S. are at risk of eviction due to the crisis, yada, yada, moratoriums expiring. But then also saying if the past trends hold, they have a link to another study, the eviction crisis will lead to higher rates of COVID infection, especially the new Delta variant, because if you think about it, people leave. I didn't mention this, but like if you have to go and you don't have a place to go, where do you go? So you go either you beg your friends and family, can I stay on your couch? And imagine you're a single mom with 1 kid, 2 kids, 3 kids. You're a family with 2 parents and 1 kid or something, or 2 kids. Most people are like, we love you, but we don't have the space. Or suddenly you are all together and you're like 7 or 8 people in a 1 or 2 bedroom, right? So imagine what that does to COVID, to people's stress levels, to their, increases in violence, frankly. You're going to see higher prevalence of child abuse and domestic violence from that. So, but the COVID rates are going to explode once people are like no longer in a home there. Because if you don't have a social network where there's a social safety net, since the state isn't helping you, you might also just go into a car with how many people? You might have to go sleep under a bridge. And now these kids are like taken from you in foster care. So these are the ripple effects that, again, to diss on the mental health profession as a whole, mental health professionals are probably not thinking about this like at all. Just saying, any mental health professionals listening, they're like, oh crap, maybe I should like be involved in something. Yeah. So anyway,
you can't even wash your hands if you're living outside.
Right. So what do you, like, we're going to psychoanalyze these people? Like, oh, well, what about your childhood? Who cares about your childhood? Like you're becoming homeless now. So like, okay, your childhood sucked and now you're homeless because housing is a hyper commodity, a financialized hyper commodity on a global scale. Okay, come on. So anyway, but then they go into, so the racial component here is, but then they show that the eviction let looms largest in Black majority neighborhoods. And it says creating the potential to decimate entire neighborhoods. And so it defines eviction as forced relocation. And like I said, that's the soft eviction piece I really think needs to be understood. They're saying that it's a critical and understudied mechanism that drives residential mobility, especially in inner city neighborhoods, especially among lower income families. They keep kind of defining it, which is unnecessary. And then they say a landlord must have a legal cause. That's actually not even really true.
No.
But then they kind of like lay out the background. But then another piece here, because we should emphasize this, because I guess, we're therapists, we should say this. It says here, low income tenants who are displaced are generally forced into substandard housing in poorer and higher crime neighborhoods. Can evictions cause psychological trauma, increase the likelihood of suicide, increased emergency room usage, decrease credit access, and lead to homelessness? The problem is especially traumatizing for children, impacting their emotional, social, and physical well-being, and increasing the likelihood of lead poisoning, food insecurity, and issues with academic performance. And another thing to throw into that is, imagine there is a family that gets evicted, and let's say they do find some housing in, say, an hour to 2 hour commute outside of where they used to live. And let's say for the last maybe 10 years or so, they've built some roots there. And those kids have made some friends if you think of your own, say, elementary and middle school experience, you say, oh, well, I grew up with those kids. That was my best friend, when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. And suddenly you lose all your friends at this developmental stage of your life where it's becoming increasingly necessary for you to have strong peer bonds with your friends, that you lose all of that. And now you're going to see them far less. And now you're like that immediately isolated, ostracized kid at the new school that the other kids are like picking on, and you don't know how to make friends. And you're all
if you can get into the new school, because also there's a lag from the time that you leave the school to where you can be enrolled in a new one.
Right. So then it goes on. So again, it goes into the racial piece. It says the COVID pandemic has exacerbated historical racial inequities in housing security, disproportionately affecting renter households and bringing the dangers of housing instability and evictions into stark relief. The moratoriums and emergency protections for renters, in addition to quarantines and social distancing, have been a somewhat effective measure to prevent the spread. And then it goes on and it says, so some of that was good. It definitely slowed down the spread and evictions. And then it kind of just goes on. I'm just sorry. I just want to, because this is stuff we don't really, Harry and I don't touch on as much, but this is really, really important. So it says past studies highlight the link between evictions and Black communities. And it goes on to point out that a neighborhood's racial composition on evictions has been studied at the city and metropolitan level. It looks at Atlanta. It references a study where landlords repeatedly filed against the same tenant, found that the share of the renter population that is Black has a stronger predictive value than the share of the renter population that is cost burdened. So that's really fascinating, right? Because typically we would say, well, it's
economic
not
issue,
right? Yeah. This is the class reductionist argument sometimes of saying, well, this research is saying that being Black is a stronger predictor than your income level for being evicted, right? Which means this is where it's either overt racism, perhaps on the side of the landlord. It could be, and this is where like every little sort of node in the system is fascinating, where it's like, is it the landlord being racist? Is it the cops being racist? Is it the judge being racist? Is there something historically sort of integrated within Black communities and their responses, right? Like when I said, when you see the eviction notice, like, are you possibly either more confused or less equipped, or your social network, there's less information in the network that tells you how to properly respond without getting the unlawful detainer on your record and so on. There's a lot of factors. It's probably a blend of all those different things. But
including that it's a financial consideration. If somebody is seeing your home as an investment and think that they could enhance their investment better by not having a Black person in it, then you're just evicted because you're Black so he can make more money, or she can. So that's another motive.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot of factors. So it also it kind of goes on with some of the same studies. Anyone can kind of look into it in the show notes. But then I guess they're saying, a study in Las Vegas found that there could be an overstated numerical significance of the racial composition of neighborhoods. But then with all these controls, they found the Black percentage of neighborhood is still significantly the most likely to be evicted. So, so anyway, they kind of go on. I think they make the case really well with like a shit ton of data. Like I'm only about maybe 20% into this article. So I do recommend that everyone read it in the show notes. They even go into some visualizations later on. And so here's another reason. I mean, I think sometimes our and other, I guess, lefty sort of class focused types, I think will say, we need to focus on the class aspect, and we do, and we need to, I think, think about renter protection advocacy work, whether it's like rent control, just cause ordinances, right to counsel legislation. These things need to be placed into as many places as possible. So if you are, wherever you live, if you actually have like really poor renter protections, you might just want to Google it and just say like housing advocacy or activism or tenant union and look up what's going on near you, because someone's probably trying to work on strengthening these things. If you want to think of it as, I'm an anti-racist. Well, this is like very anti-racist work. It is not, you might not run around be saying Black Lives Matter, rent control now. You actually just say rent control now, but it disproportionately would help Black families, if you think of it that way, or like undocumented immigrant Latino families and other immigrants and stuff, right?
Also, what you might want to do is work against the capitalist system that allows housing to be commodified in the first place, because a lot of this injustice is the real estate industry trying to maximize a financial investment that happens to be where people live and should not be subject to being commodified. People's basic needs shouldn't be commodified because it takes away their means of life. Also, we should mention that pregnant women, in the articles that you recommended, and that'll be in the feed, pregnant women who are being evicted have lower birth weight children and children with more physical issues. And of course, that means they need more medical care, which they're not going to get. And they're also more likely to live in poor neighborhoods, particularly poor Black neighborhoods, where they put the incinerators. And so Black children have more asthma. This whole idea of real estate is so intertwined with the colossal failure of making basic needs commodities in a capitalist system, that too cannot be extricated. This eviction crisis of about 40 million people being evicted and thrown out is an atrocity.
Right.
And therapists looking at it should not only think, well, what in your personal makeup might have led you to be evicted? They also need to consider
bad choices. It's your childhood.
Yes, exactly.
It's your Oedipal complex. That must be it, right?
That's right. They should look at the commodification, exactly,
right,
of which you are a victim.
Yeah. There's also one interesting, this article, one that we'd found was talking mainly, it was actually saying Black women in particular, Black single moms, Black families are actually going to be the most, if you really break down all the demographic data, are going to be the most and are the most impacted, which is nuts. This Brookings piece goes into things like I just mentioned, the right to counsel. If you're facing eviction, you should just have there should be a lawyer that can like look at the notice, say, is this even legal? Did the landlord do the legal thing? That would be nice. That is more state funding allocated for tenants, which most states don't want to do. And most, the tie between capital and the state is always going to say like, we don't know. That's too much money. Let's go bomb it.
It's too much because we won't tax the rich. That's why it's too much.
Well, because we got to like pay for bombing brown people somewhere because like they have more oil or whatever. So there's that thing. They also call on, what is it? More rental assistance, obviously, but that's the thing is with that, that's really tough too, because I forgot what the stat was. I don't know if you saw Harriet, but I think I don't know if it's most tenants, but I mean, millions of tenants just haven't gotten the rent relief. It's either like red tape issues or bureaucracy issues, lack of education on how to do it.
Only 20% of the government money that was allocated was even used because locally they make it harder to get and make it more complicated. And
all the means testing crap.
Exactly.
What's your social security number? What's your address? Well, that's not the address we have on file. And we're like, well, we moved 3 times because we were evicted by this asshole. And they say, oh, sorry, you can't have the money, right? You have to fill out the proper paperwork. This thing was, you didn't fill this out properly.
Deliberately complex because they have this capitalist ideology that if you're rich, you are wonderful. That's one of Trump's big, I'm rich, claims to fame. Whereas if you're poor, that you're bad.
Right.
So there's a bias.
So in the last 2 recommendations they have, one is to change zoning laws so that more housing can be built, which is sometimes that's controversial. Gavin Newsom just passed what are called SB 9 and 10, which would basically make it. And so, I mean, I think it's like somewhat better than the status quo, but it's also going to be a really nightmarish shit show at the same time, because what he did in California is he removed single family home zoning, where all these like suburban areas where you can only build single family homes. Now, all of a sudden you can build whatever you want in these areas. So you could either, if there's a big backyard, you can build a duplex back there now. If you wanted to demolish the single family home and build like a small apartment building with like 10 to 20 units, you can do that. So I think developers are going to go create, homeowners associations. And unfortunately, people that are like doing a lot of Zoom work from home are going to be pissed off because there's going to be a lot of noise. And maybe the air is going to get dusty or something. There's going to be like somewhat minor inconveniences for a lot of us living in these areas, but it is going to increase the housing stock. The only problem is my worry with that is that it's not going to be quote unquote affordable housing. It's not going to be public housing. Maybe there'll be Section 8 vouchers built into some of these housing, but the developers are doing it for profit. So it's a little bit scary, but like my fingers are crossed that it's going to go well.
Well, I can give you the New York example that didn't go too well because they mandated that new buildings have to have a certain number of affordable units. And so they studied one such building, and the affordable units were put in one place with a beautiful lobby and a door person and a pool. The expensive units. The affordable ones had a separate
in the basement, the rats
entrance. They couldn't use the pool. They didn't have a door person, and they were far inferior and segregated.
Right.
And so that to the letter of the law, they built affordable units. To the spirit of a law of equal housing, they didn't do it, but they didn't care. They were making money.
Yeah. That's screwed up. I think we're going to see a lot of stuff like that, and then it's going to be too late. There's going to be like thousands of units built, and we'll go like, oh shit. So a small percentage is for lower income people. Most of it's quote unquote market rate. And then finally, I thought the coolest thing about this Brookings Institute thing was it said, finally, increase the minimum wage. Evictions disproportionately hit renters with low incomes and poverty. Nowhere in the country can a single working adult afford a 2-bedroom apartment on a minimum wage. So I thought that was a nice they topped it off at the very end because we didn't talk about this, but whether you want to call it the wage productivity gap or just basically rents have gone up everywhere in the U.S. in the last few decades, and wages have not at all, or barely. Where they barely have. So that's one of many basic factors in the crisis, right? That if you're getting paid the same wages from like 20 years ago or 10 years ago, or a little bit more, especially adjusted for inflation, there's no way in hell you can actually afford anything. And so this is also where the market rate is like, anytime you hear someone say that, I don't advocate for violence, but I advocate for like, don't put up with that shit. Market rate is a bullshit concept. When people say it's market rate rent, that is like capitalist propaganda language. I have to say it in plain English. It's bullshit. Market rate is a bullshit concept. So don't let these people fool you with that.
And
concept.
Also, housing should not be a commodity on the market. It should be a human right to live in safe, affordable housing with clean air, clean water, basics, protection from the elements. You have to say, look, if you want to have capitalism, you can't have it apply to the basic needs of people: food, air, water, housing, sleep, medical care, and protection from violence, because those are basic needs for life. Yeah. And people's basic needs are not compatible with being commodified. That's capitalism, and that's very bad for us.
Yeah. And I don't have a ton more that I wanted to say, except maybe I'm a big fan of this. It's a new-ish, they've been around for maybe 1 to 2 years, a new-ish group called the Autonomous Tenants Union Network, or AUTUN. If anyone wants to check them out, they're a North American collaborative of tenants unions they call themselves autonomous, in that they are independent from nonprofits and government granting like funding structures. So they're operating a little bit outside of the what would you call it? So Bill Gates can't fund them, and the state, the local government. And we're not saying government's bad, but the capital influence state structures on a local, state, or federal level can't fund them. So that you have these sort of career-driven staff members driving them. They're just driven by like everyday tenants that are trying to just secure their housing and exercise their rights and whatnot.
Can you repeat the name again so everyone can have it right in front of them?
So AUTUN, Autonomous Tenants Union Network. Their website is ATUN-RSIA, because the second part is the Spanish version. .org. But you can just look them up, Autonomous Tenants Union Network. And they're technically they're trying to actually be like the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations of tenants unions in North America, which is really, I think, awesome and ambitious, and also really hard, because our union in Santa Barbara is an affiliate. But so you can't join as an individual. You have to join as a tenants union, but that should incentivize you, listeners, to form a tenants union if you have not.
Or join one.
Where you live. Join an existing one, or form one if there's not one. And you can talk to AUTUN and say, how do I form a tenants union? They have resources on the website and how to form tenants unions. And tenants unions aren't like the only way to do it. I'm not full of hatred toward the nonprofits and stuff. I use that term nonprofit industrial complex sometimes, but there are great nonprofit housing policy and advocacy orgs out there that are doing great work. So you can also just sort of support them, get involved, as they say. I do think that the tenant union ground level, bottom up organizing is preferred if you can get linked into that.
And also remember, if you're in the therapy community in any fashion, whether as a therapist, whether as someone who is in therapy, remember that capitalism is controlling the rental market. If you're being evicted or threatened, it's not necessarily because you made bad choices. It's because you are living in a capitalist country and housing is a commodity, and they're trying to get more money by throwing you out of your home.
Right. Exactly. And so and I think you can paper over this as a therapist pretty easily and say, you have this lower income client or whatever, or maybe not, middle income, whatever. And they're saying, we actually have a couple of tenants right now that they're strongly in the middle, maybe middle upper of working class. And, they do like PR work for like big corporations and crap like that. And they're facing, their landlord is like, I don't want to say too much, but basically we did some research and they come from a long family of tax evaders that have their LLC vehicles installed in the Virgin Islands, so they pay lower tax rates and stuff. So we're actually trying to figure out how to like use that against them, but it's actually really hard because the U.S. tax code and tax courts and all this stuff, they're not really. Sometimes they do some good stuff, but they usually don't really win against the bad guys that well, you know?
No, because the bad guys are wealthy capitalists who pay people's campaigns. Exactly. And of course, it's absurd to have a tax rate that people can basically evade by investing in the Canary Islands or the Cayman Islands or the Virgin Islands. Right. Obviously, if the government said we will invade if you allow this to continue, they wouldn't allow it to continue. Yeah. If we spend our military there. Yeah. And Jeff Bezos got a refund, the richest man in the world, because if you manipulate your taxes enough, you can. And if you have a corporate lawyer whose expertise is in tax evasion, like Weisselberg, who was Trump's lawyer, then, accountant, then of course you can do it. But then you're not paying the taxes, and the burden is falling on people who are overburdened, and social services don't get funded. And so you're abandoned by your country. Yeah. That's why we have to change it.
So therapists listening, social workers listening. I mean, social workers probably get it more than therapists generally, but it's not just in your head. If your clients are getting evicted, it has nothing to do with their childhood. Well, I guess maybe some intergenerational analysis, but
yeah, it probably has a little bit to do with your childhood. But your childhood is not the only factor in your eviction. It has a lot to do with capitalism. It has a lot to do with racism. It has everything to do with housing as a commodity.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, all the therapists listening, you know what to do. Get sharpen the guillotines, and and by that I mean ask people how they feel
about evictions, and
how does the eviction make you feel?
Tuned in.
Where do you feel that eviction in your body? Where do you what emotion? So sadness. You're feeling the sadness. What color is the sadness? That's right.
Then maybe you want to be empowered by joining those other sad people who are also being evicted.
Well, maybe your landlord is just they're just engaging in projective transference based on their own insecure, their like anal stage disruption.
That's right.
Therapist. Okay,
that's right.
Well,
however,
I think
you can say to your therapist, many of them have no idea that they're throwing me out of my home. This is an investment. An anonymous capitalist investment, and that's why capitalism should not have anything to do with basic needs.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well,
okay.
I think that sums it up.
Yeah, we should thank everybody again, all those Patreon subscribers who make this possible, and Liam, who also does great, and our listeners. We know not everybody has discretionary income, but we want people to talk about our program and to suggest it so we can reach people, because that's the point.
Yeah, send this to your therapist. And if you want to give us a feedback on anything, we get a fair amount of emails. You can be another person who sends us emails. It's not just in your head at gmail.com. And if you want to become a patron, you get early access to the episodes like a week or so before. And you get access to our little Discord chat room thingy, as well as
reading group.
Yeah, the monthly reading groups. We just did one on Fanon, and we're not totally sure what the next one's going to be. But you can become a patron at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Thank you.
Thank you.
And bye. Watch out for landlords. Bye.
Bye-bye. Watch out for capitalism.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader
overhead view, it explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and capitalism hits home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.